In 1960, Fidel Castro moved his UN delegation from a Manhattan hotel to one in the heart of Harlem. It was a power move, a direct challenge to American racism. From the Hotel Teresa, he positioned his revolution as a true ally to black people everywhere. He was even greeted in Harlem by Malcolm X himself. He then sat and had dinner with the black workers of the hotel after President Eisenhower of the time refused to meet with him. Decades later, that promise of liberation was in the streets burning. The protests that shook Cuba in the 2020s were the final bill for a revolution that failed its most loyal citizens. The black faces in the crowd were a direct representation of a decades-old lie. So, what happened? The slogan was liberation. The reality was something else entirely. This is what really happened to the black people in Cuba. Before we talk about revolution, we need to talk about the machine it was supposed to replace. The Spanish didn't discover Cuba, but they did systematically dismantle it. The Taino and Saboni people were the first to be erased, wiped out by disease and violence within a century of arrival. Disease being the greatest tool. This created a vacuum, and the Spanish had a perfect, brutal solution: enslaved Africans. Now, every colony in the Americas had slavery, but Cuba was the Olympics of brutality. Let's get the numbers on the board. The entire United States imported about 388,000 enslaved Africans. Cuba, they imported almost 800,000 in the 1800s alone. They were the last ones to the party and decided to out-evil everyone. This was a human furnace with plantation aesthetics. The life expectancy for an enslaved person in a Cuban sugar mill was so short, they were treated as disposable equipment, worked them to death and import a replacement. It was industrial scale horror. And the Spanish, being the bureaucrats of white supremacy, created a detailed receipt for all of this. The Sistema de Castas, a racial caste system that legally ranked you. At the top, your pure Spanish grandpa. At the bottom, the enslaved African. Your proximity to whiteness was a deed to your own humanity. And that's to be expected for Africans in Latin America. The resistance started the second the first chain clicked shut. Meet Jose Antonio Aponte, a black carpenter, artist, and veteran. In 1812, he planned a rebellion for a new nation. His plot was discovered, and the Spanish made an example of him. Execution, decapitation, his head in a cage. The message was clear. Ambition will be met with absolute terror, but you can't cage an idea. The fire Aponte lit was just the first spark. The inferno was coming. So you have a population systematically brutalized for centuries. What do you think happens next? The spark finally caught gunpowder, and the fight for Cuban independence was a war against Spain, but it was also a war for the soul of a future nation, and black Cubans were its beating heart. Enter the Mambises. This wasn't a formal army, it was a radical, multiracial rebellion born from the sugar fields, and at its forefront was Antonio Maceo, the Bronze Titan, a military genius who understood that this was about building a nation where his blackness would finally mean freedom, not slavery. The man was literally shot over 24 times and kept charging, but his real power went beyond the battlefield. It was in his uncompromising politics. When the first war ended with the Pacto Zayan, a peace treaty that gave Cuba to Spain and left slavery intact, Maceo delivered the single most important protest in Cuban history, La Protesta de Beragua. While other commanders signed surrender documents, Maceo stood before the Spanish general and declared the war was not over. His terms were non-negotiable. No independence without abolition. No freedom without racial justice. No one is free until we're all free. This was a black man declaring that a Cuba built on slavery wasn't a Cuba worth having. He was writing a moral code for the entire revolution, a code that would never fully be honored. Maceo died in battle in 1896, 2 years before the U.S. sailed in to liberate Cuba. Liberate, right? The war for a black nation ended. The management changed hands and the bill for freedom was left unpaid. So, the Spanish got kicked out, but Cuba's independence came with an extended stay from the United States. Enter the Platt Amendment. The U.S. legally reserved the right to intervene in Cuban affairs anytime they felt like it. Oh, and they also helped themselves to a permanent naval base at Guantanamo Bay. You know, as a souvenir, right? This was the neo-colonial playbook. Why own the colony outright when you could just own its government, its economy, and its foreign policy? It was independence with a U.S.-shaped boot on its neck. And the economy? Let's just say the sugar barons got a massive upgrade. American capital flooded in, buying up the best land and consolidating the sugar industry into a few powerful U.S. corporations. The same people who were liberated from Spanish plantations now found themselves working for American shareholders. It was a corporate takeover disguised as liberation. And through it all, a familiar pattern re-emerged. The racial hierarchy the revolutionaries fought to dismantle just got a fresh coat of paint. Black veterans who fought for independence found themselves shut out of political power and economic opportunity. This era culminated in a man named Fulgencio Batista. If I butchered that, please tell me. Look, a former sergeant who became the U.S. friendly strongman. He was a political leader for 11 years and president for 7. His regime was a masterpiece of corruption, running Cuba as a playground for American mobsters and tourists while poverty festered. For Black Cubans, the promise of the independence wars was now a distant memory. They had traded a Spanish master for an American one in a system that still saw them as labor, not people. The stage was set, and waiting in the wings was a young lawyer who understood that this entire corrupt system was built on a powder keg. Every system creates its own worst enemy. For the corrupt mob-run Batista regime, their enemies were led by a young lawyer who understood the power of a good story. Fidel Castro knew exactly how to package a revolution, and part of that packaging was a direct appeal to the people Batista had left behind. The poor, the rural, and the Black Cubans who'd been promised equality before and gotten a raw deal. The revolution's early moves were genuinely radical. In 1959, Castro gave a major speech explicitly attacking racial discrimination. They passed laws desegregating beaches, parks, and workplaces almost overnight. For the first time since the Mambises, the state was officially on the side of racial justice. Only took 80 more years, but they got there. They launched a literacy campaign, sending young volunteers into the countryside. It was a massive social project that disproportionately benefited Black communities with historically less access to education. But here's where the brand and genius kicked in. That trip to New York in 1960 for the UN summit, staying at the Hotel Teresa after being kicked out of a Midtown hotel, meeting with Malcolm X, having lunch with all the Black workers at the hotel after being refused by President Eisenhower, it was a global signal. He was telling Black America and the world, my revolution is the one that gets it. Your struggle is my struggle. It was powerful. It was seductive. And for a moment, it did feel real. But turning the revolution into a government is where promises often go to die. And the gap between the vibrant, multiracial rebellion in the streets and the new power structure forming in Havana was about to become a chasm. So the revolution won. Now what? You get the man who will run the show for the next 5 decades. And to understand what happened to Black Cuba, you need to understand Fidel's favorite magic trick, being the hero abroad and a villain at home. First, the hero resume. And let's be fair, it is stacked. The man took a country where nearly a quarter of people couldn't read and basically eradicated illiteracy. He built a healthcare system that made sure people didn't die from treatable diseases. For Black Cubans, this was absolutely life-changing. Your kids learn to read, your mother sees a doctor, better life expectancy, better opportunities for the youth. It was genuinely good work being done. And on the world stage, he played the anti-imperialist rock star. In 1975, he sent Cuban troops to Angola to fight against South African apartheid forces. That was a message to the Black diaspora. I'm the one who actually shows up for you. But here's the flip side. The same government that sent doctors to Africa had a special set of tools for his own people. Dissenting against Fidel Castro was a crime. You couldn't disagree. The government had a law for pre-criminal dangerousness, meaning they could jail you for who they thought you might be. Imagine being a Black activist wanting to discuss racial inequality and the state labels you a danger to the revolution for pointing out its flaws. And then came the grandest illusion of all. In 1962, just 3 years into his rule, Castro stood up and declared racism solved. Not improved, solved, like it was a math problem, right? This was the official adoption of mestizaje as state policy. Unlike the Spanish caste system that ranked races, mestizaje promised a unified cosmic race. It sounded progressive, but in practice, it was just a different tool for the same goal. Erasure. By celebrating a generic mixed identity, the state could now argue that specific Black struggles didn't exist. Talking about racism was now counter-revolutionary. You were going against the very definition of the nation. It was the ultimate silencing tactic. Overnight, talking about racial discrimination became an act of betrayal. How could you have racism in a post-racial society? You can't, so shut up. The reality was they didn't eliminate racism, they just made it illegal to mention it. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, taking Cuba's economy down with it, that hidden racism would explode into plain sight. Now, let's talk about how Cuba became the world's most controversial Airbnb for radicals. While Fidel was telling Black Cubans at home to stop complaining about racism, his government was rolling out the welcome mat for Black activists from the United States. Enter Assata Shakur, a former Black Panther convicted of killing a New Jersey state trooper in a shootout she maintains was a setup. She escaped prison in 1979 and by 1984 was living in Cuba with political asylum. For Cuba, Assata was a geopolitical chess piece. Her presence let them tell America, you call her a terrorist, we call her a freedom fighter. The people you call criminals are actually heroes. It was brilliant propaganda. It cemented Cuba's image as the ultimate anti-imperialist rebel, a sanctuary for those persecuted by the very system Castro had confronted from the Hotel Teresa. But here's the brutal irony. Cuba offered a safe house to Black American radicals while telling its own Black citizens that their struggles were over. Assata could find refuge from the FBI in Havana, but a Black Cuban asking for the same justice she fought for could find themselves in a prison of a different kind. The message was clear. Your Black struggle is welcome here only when it makes the U.S. uncomfortable. But when it challenges the Cuban power structure, is counter-revolutionary. This dual reality, champion of international Black resistance, silencer of domestic Black dissent, became unsustainable. And when Cuba's sugar daddy in Moscow vanished, The entire contradiction was about to crash into the dinner tables of every black family in Cuba. So who was the woman at the center of this Cold War storm? To understand Assata Shakur, you have to understand what she was running from. This was the COINTELPRO era. The FBI was watching and systematically dismantling black radicals. The Black Panther Party's free breakfast programs and community defense were met with police raids and fabricated charges. And Assata was a main target. By 1977, she faced 10 criminal trials on charges from bank robbery to murder. Most ended in acquittals or dismissals. The state was throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick. The final conviction came from a 1973 traffic stop on a New Jersey turnpike that left one trooper and her comrade dead. She was unarmed but still framed for the murder. So when she escaped from a maximum security prison in 1979, it looked like a masterpiece of political theater. The most watched black woman in America simply vanished. And when she reappeared in Cuba years later, it was the ultimate middle finger to the system that tried to bury her. She was living proof that sometimes the only way to survive America is to leave it. Her asylum was victory. The little girl from New York had become a global symbol, a ghost that haunted 2 superpowers, and a legend that refused to die by America's hands. Rest in peace, Assata. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba's economy struggled so much that it entered what they call the special period. And let me tell you, there was nothing special about it. Imagine this. The country lost $4.3 billion in trade almost overnight. It's like your entire paycheck vanishing while your rent doubles. The average Cuban lost 20 pounds. People were so hungry they were eating zoo animals and household pets. Yikes. But here's where the revolution's racial lie got exposed to daylight. While everyone suffered, black Cubans were positioned to suffer most. Why? Because when the tourist industry became the only way to survive, guess who suddenly became unemployable at luxury hotels? The same black Cubans whose grandparents built this island's wealth. The government created a tourist apartheid, a 2-tier economy where dollars were king and black faces were considered bad for business. You could have a PhD in engineering, but if you were dark-skinned, you'd be lucky to get a job washing dishes in a hotel. Meanwhile, who had family in Miami sending money? Mostly white Cubans. So while some could ride out the crisis with valuable American dollars, black Cubans were left with worthless pesos and empty shells. The special period didn't create racism in Cuba. It just took the revolution's colorblind myth, dipped it in economic desperation, and revealed what was always there. A system where your melanin content determined your survival odds. The great equalizing revolution had produced one of the most unequal societies in the hemisphere, and everyone could finally see it. So where does that leave us today? With a new generation of black Cubans who aren't buying the old lies. The children of the special period became digital warriors. They watched the government declare racism solved while they couldn't get jobs in their own country's tourist industry. They saw that skin color become an economic liability in a worker's paradise. And in 2021, when a pandemic crashed another broken economy, they've had enough. Like, the protests that summer were organic, angry, and streaming live from smartphones. Young black Cubans use the internet to show the world their reality. We're hungry, we're tired, and we're not invisible. This is the ultimate contradiction of modern Cuba. The revolution's own education system created citizens smart enough to see through its myths. Artists like the Afro-Cuban rapper Soandri are using their music not to praise the revolution, but to document the racism it never solved. The government's response? The same old playbook. Arrest the loudest voices, cut the internet, and call protesters CIA agents. But the cat's out of the bag. The 2020s have proven that black Cubans don't need a revolutionary savior. They're their own. They're using the tools the revolution gave them, education, international awareness, to demand the equality it promised them. The state can lock up protesters, but it can't uninvent the smartphone. And it can't unsee the future being built in the streets of Havana. So what happened to the black people in Cuba? From the sugar plantations to the independence wars, from the revolutionary promise to the special period's hunger, black Cubans were always the engine of that nation and the first to be betrayed by its mechanics. The revolution didn't fail because it was communist. It failed because it was contradictory. It offered literacy but banned free thought. It championed Angola's freedom while rationing dissent at home. It gave Assata Shakur sanctuary while denying its own citizens the right to complain. The story of black Cuba is about persistence. It's the ghost in a revolutionary machine. The drumbeat that survived slavery, survived Castro, and is now streaming live from the streets of Havana. The revolution they were promised remains unfinished, but for the first time in generations, black Cubans are writing their next chapter themselves, and they're not asking for permission.